Today, we're diving into something, well, it's a bit controversial. We're going to look at an argument that connects a society's marriage customs directly to its political stability. Yeah, it's a connection you probably haven't thought much about. So let's just jump right in with the big question, right? Could the way people get married in a society actually predict a civil war? I know, it sounds like a huge stretch, but according to one theory, the answer is a loud and clear yes. And we're about to break down exactly how that's supposed to work. Okay, so the basis for this whole explainer is an article that makes a really bold claim. The argument is simple. Wherever you find widespread polygamy, you're also likely to find turmoil and conflict. So let's follow the breadcrumbs and break down the logic step by step. And the whole thing starts with this really striking correlation. The author basically says, hey, look at a list of the world's 20 most fragile states. And guess what? Polygamy is a common thread running through every single one of them. So you have to ask, why? What's the connection? Alright, so the first piece of the puzzle is all about economics, specifically how polygamy completely throws off what the source calls the marriage market. And you don't need a PhD in math to see how this works. It's pretty stark. Let's say you have about the same number of men and women. If just the top 10% of men marry 4 women each, well, do the math. The bottom 30% of men can't marry at all. There's just no one left. It's a simple and kind of brutal numbers game. Okay, so this shortage of available women has a massive knock-on effect on something called the bride price. In a lot of these societies, a man has to pay the bride's family to get married. But when there are way fewer women available, you guessed it, the price skyrockets. It's just basic supply and demand. And we're not talking about a small price hike here. The article gives this absolutely staggering example from South Sudan. A young guy, probably not very well educated, might need anywhere from 30 to 300 cattle to pay for a bride. I mean, think about that. That's a fortune. It's completely out of reach for a huge number of young men. So, you see where this is going, right? You start with an economic problem, a messed up marriage market, and it spirals into this huge social problem. You end up with a whole generation of young guys who are just priced out of getting married. What on earth does that do to a society? Well, for these men, the fallout is just devastating. In a lot of these traditional cultures, you're not really seen as a man, as a full adult, until you have a wife and kids. So these guys are left in limbo. They're sexually frustrated, they're pushed to the margins of society, and they feel like they have no real place in their own community. And that kind of desperation, it's a powerful thing. The article points out that some guys get so desperate they turn to crime, like raiding cattle just to get the money for a bride price. But that's not the worst of it. This whole situation creates a perfect opening for something much bigger and much more violent. And here it is. This is the direct link to civil war that the theory proposes. You've got this massive pool of angry, sidelined young men, and they are the absolute perfect recruiting ground for rebel armies and warlords. You can just imagine the recruiting pitch, can't you? A rebel leader comes along and says, hey, you got no future, no wife, no status. Join us. Fight with us. You'll get loot, you'll get money, you can finally afford a wife. Or, hey, even better, we'll just get one for you. I mean, for a young guy with literally no other options, how could you possibly say no to that? And look, this isn't just some wild theory pulled out of thin air. The source article actually cites research from academics at Yale, and they pinpointed the super high bride price as a critical factor that pushes young men towards joining these violent groups for political reasons. The article even names names, giving us real-world examples. Groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria, Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan, they are known to use the promise of a wife, sometimes a cheap marriage, sometimes a captured one, as a seriously powerful recruiting tool. Okay, so that's the argument in a nutshell. That's the chain of events from polygamy to civil war. But what's happening on a global scale? Is this trend fading away, or is it actually getting worse? Well, it's complicated. The source says that globally, the practice is actually in retreat. But it's not that simple. In some places, there are actually campaigns to bring it back. And then you got a totally different kind of shift happening in places like the West, where attitudes about it are evolving. Just look at this one example from the US. The article brings up a Gallup poll that shows the number of Americans who think polygamy is morally okay more than doubled in about a decade. It went from 7% to 17%. That's a pretty big jump. So, at the end of the day, you're left with these two totally opposing views. On one hand, the article notes that advocates say, hey, this promotes social harmony, it's an alternative to cheating. But on the other hand, the source pushes back hard, pointing to the absolute mayhem in places like South Sudan, Afghanistan, and northern Nigeria. And that's where we'll leave it, with a final thought to chew on. Whether you buy this article's argument or not, it does make you think. It forces you to ask a bigger question. As our own ideas about marriage and relationships keep changing, what other surprising, deep connections between our private lives and public stability are we completely overlooking?